Today, we're going to talk about the top 5 most ridiculous genetics in the sport of arm wrestling. Now, the thing about this topic is that it is entirely subjective as to which genetics are actually the most advantageous for arm wrestling. If you ask Devin Larratt, he will say that the person with the longest arm and the biggest hand has the best genetics for the sports. However, someone like John Brzenk seems to be more of the school of thought that a short arm and a big hand combination is better. And you could even make the case that a short arm and a small hand is the best. The reality is there are no universally superior genetics for arm wrestling. All different combinations of hand size and arm length have different use cases and are better and worse depending on the style match. So in this video, we're not only going to be talking about the people who have the most advantageous genetics for the sport, since this is very subjective. What we're going to talk about in this video is the combination of the most advantageous genetics and the most apparently intimidating genetics. Starting off the list with number 5, in my opinion, we have Cleve Dean. If you are newer to the sport, it's possible that you have never heard of Cleve Dean before. But Cleve was one of the very earliest rivals of the legendary John Brzenk way back in the day when they used different style tables and filmed everything with hand-cranked toasters. Although reports vary to a great extent, Cleve is said to be as tall as 6'7" and even as high as 500 plus pounds. So of course, Cleve has massive hands and a super long arm. And as you would expect, Cleve was known for his completely dominant hand control. This even caused John Brzenk to really struggle with Cleve in the beginning. Eventually, he realized that it was a fruitless task to try to out-top roll this literal giant, so John decided to take an intentionally low grip, doing everything he could to isolate Cleve's arm and avoid fighting his hand. And this strategy proved to be effective for John. As you would expect, the 6'7" Cleve Dean was not the best in a hook. But the fact that John Brzenk didn't even try to fight Cleve for height goes to show how dominant he was in that lane. John has since pondered the idea of how good Cleve could have been if he was on the good old performance-enhancing pancakes. Because at least according to John, everything that Cleve ever achieved, he achieved while being all natty. Moving on to the number 4 spot on the list, we have Jeff Dabe. Jeff Dabe quite possibly has the biggest hands in the history of arm wrestling. He also has incredibly thick wrists. Jeff has fittingly received the nickname of Popeye because of his vastly unproportional forearms. Similarly to Cleve, Jeff's massive hand and wrist makes it very, very difficult to top roll him. And especially outside of straps, containment of Jeff is a near pointless endeavor. Now, some of you might be wondering why Jeff is not higher on this list. The thing about Jeff is that his forearms are clearly insane, but he's actually only 5'9" and 250 pounds. And for a super heavyweight arm wrestler, that is definitely on the smaller side of things. Another thing is that Jeff's hands in many ways are actually a disadvantage. Jeff's hands aren't just super thick, but they are also super wide. This means that in order to take a fair grip where his webbing is level with his opponents, he is forced to essentially dad move his opponents all the time. This makes him extremely susceptible to getting forced into a hook, as well as giving his opponents a significant leverage advantage. But still, Jeff is a legend of the sport and is certainly an intimidating character. Moving on to number 3 on the list, we have Matthias, and I'm not exactly sure how to say his last name, but he's also known as the real-life Hellboy. Now, people like Matthias and Jeff are pretty similar in the way that they have a massively unproportional forearm, unproportional to the rest of their body. But of course, the most obvious difference is that Matthias has one normal arm and one superhero arm. Of course, this is entirely subjective, but I think that the single massive arm is cooler than the double massive arm, and probably more intimidating. Ever since Devin Larratt has talked so much about his pumpkin training theory, the idea of intentionally making an arm longer than the other has gained popularity. But Matthias is the physical embodiment of pumpkin training. No matter how long someone trains their one arm, I don't think they will ever reach the level that Matthias has achieved in that regard. He looks like he's straight out of a video game. And although Matthias has not reached the best in the world level as of yet, he still has had a solid amount of success. Here's Matthias in a good match against Tristo, who, if you didn't recognize him, is one of the referees from East vs. West. But once again, just like with Jeff Dabe, Matthias' extremely wide hand does make him very vulnerable to getting sucked into a hook. And it's difficult to really know whether or not his abnormal proportions are that much of an advantage or not. He certainly has way more musculature on his right arm, so that is a clear advantage. But the width of his hand is not always a good thing in terms of arm wrestling strategy. But that doesn't really matter. The important part is that it looks cool. Moving on to number 2 on this list, we have Oleg Zak. Oleg is very similar to Matthias conceptually. Just like Matthias, he has one arm that is way bigger and way stronger than his other arm. The The only difference is that for Oleg, his left arm is his monster arm instead of his right arm. Now, some of the people on this list do look like they would have had a huge advantage on the table, but their results don't necessarily back the idea that they have some unfair advantage over everyone else. None of the people mentioned previously have been considered unbeatable. However, with Oleg, this begins to change. He definitely has all the results to back up his appearance. Oleg is a multiple-time world champion at 80 kilograms on the left arm. He also has a 70-kilogram world title from a bit further back. And throughout this time, Oleg was pretty much considered undefeatable. However, as many of you know, Oleg was involved in a very bad accident some years back, and it has taken him a long time to recover. And most people do not consider him to be at his peak level currently. So you may have seen him at East vs West recently, and although he is still doing extremely well, just understand that he probably can get even better than he is right now, and this current level does not reflect his peak level. Historically, we've seen Oleg defeating John Brzenk, nearly defeating Devin Larratt, and even giving people like Levan Saganishvili a super hard time in practice pulls. Sure, that is practice, but remember, Oleg is an 80-kilogram puller. So Levan is like 2.5 Olegs. Pound for pound, I think it is very possible that Oleg Zak is the greatest left-handed puller of all time. And this brings us to the number one guy on this list. And I think this will be very easy for a lot of people to guess. But the greatest arm wrestling genetics in history, in my opinion, goes to none other than Levan Saganishvili. Pretty much everyone else on this list has some sort of crazy genetic advantage, but it's balanced out by a weakness in a different area. Jeff has huge hands and forearms, but he's vulnerable to a hook. Oleg is nearly unbeatable, but he's only 80 kilograms. He doesn't really have the frame to become a total monster. But Levan essentially has all of these advantages combined with none of the disadvantages. Not only are his forearms probably just as big as Jeff Dabe's, but his hands are nearly the same size. Another thing about Levan is that he doesn't just have genetics to be huge, he has genetics to be really, really strong. Levan's appearance is not at all just for show. He is nearly 400 pounds, but as crazy as it is to say, not very much of that weight is wasted. Levan's strength pretty much matches his weight. Another thing about Levan is that he's not too tall or too short. For the super heavyweight class, people like Vitaly Laletin, who are 6'7" or something, are always going to struggle against flop pressers. But then on the other end of the spectrum, people who are 5'9", like Jeff Dabe, don't really have the frame of a super heavyweight puller and are limited to certain pulling styles. But Levan is right in the middle of both of these heights. In many ways, Levan is essentially just a bigger version of John Brzenk proportionally. He doesn't have the longest arm in the world, but he has a massive hand and a crazy strong forearm that leads to him gaining hand control against nearly everyone that he faces. The only difference is that his frame is just upscaled from that of John Brzenk. And by far, most importantly, Levan has the best beard genetics out of everyone else on this list. So there you have it, my top 5 craziest arm wrestling genetics. Shoutouts to Crimson Avenger Gaming for giving me this video idea. Also, make sure to let me know what your list is in the comments section because this topic is so subjective and I have a feeling there will be a vast array of different opinions on who are the top 5. There were definitely more people that could have made the list but did not. Maybe I'll update this list in the future, but for now, happy pumpkin training.